Firmware. Firmware is a software program permanently etched or embedded into a hardware device, such as a keyboard, hard drive, or video card. It's programmed to give permanent instructions to the hardware on how to communicate with other devices and perform functions, like basic input or output tasks. As its name suggests, firmware is somewhere between hardware and software. Firmware is a set of instructions that provide the necessary instructions to a hardware device on how the device should communicate with the other computer hardware. But how can software be programmed onto hardware? Good question. Firmware is typically stored on the read-only memory, also known as ROM, of a hardware device. In devices like cameras, where the firmware needs to be periodically updated, the firmware is embedded in a flash ROM that can be erased and rewritten, instead of the ROM, which is permanently read-only memory. Firmware can be thought of as semi-permanent, since it remains the same unless it's updated by a firmware updater. You may need to update the firmware of certain devices, such as hard drives and video cards, in order for them to work with a new operating system. CD and DVD drive manufacturers often make firmware updates available that allow the drive to read faster media. Sometimes manufacturers release firmware updates that simply make their devices work more efficiently. Firmware is also updated so a device can function longer without having to exchange the hardware for a newer device. Firmware is a computer program which is executed by a microprocessor, but it's also tightly linked to a piece of hardware and has little meaning outside of it. Firmware retains the basic instructions for hardware devices that make them operative. Without firmware, a hardware device would be non-functional. Hence, hardware can't operate without firmware, and firmware exists within the context of the hardware it's embedded in. An example of firmware on a typical PC is the BIOS. The BIOS is an acronym for Basic Input-Output System, and is also known as the System BIOS, ROM BIOS, or PC BIOS. It's a type of firmware used during the booting or startup process of an IBM PC-compatible computers. The BIOS firmware is built into PCs, and it's the first software they run when powered on.